Hello, dear friends. Today we'll continue exploring Otto Carius's memoirs. Don't forget to share your thoughts on this content and give this video a like. Well, let's get started. On the brink of life and death. I will never forget the morning of July 24th for the rest of my life. I was at the refueling station at company headquarters with 4 tanks. Major Schwanner showed up. We briefly discussed the operation again. According to the plan, the Tigers, under Lieutenant Eichhorn's command, were to pass through Dunaburg and wait for me on the outskirts of the city, on the highway to Riga. I was going to drive ahead to reconnoiter the area and then meet my men at the designated spot. I still remember well how the battalion cook prepared my favorite cucumber salad, which I hadn't eaten in a long time. Major Schwanner joked to me, "Karius, don't eat too much. It won't be good if you get shot in the stomach." As before, the commander threatened to punish me if anything happened to me during my trip by car or motorcycle. Fortunately, none of us knew what lay ahead. That day could be called a day of combat contact with the enemy in the full sense of the word. Unfortunately, the last of the roadworthy Volkswagens in my company broke down. So I set out on a motorcycle with a sidecar belonging to the medical unit. A medic was driving it. I wasn't worried about this vehicle. I've never been superstitious. It wouldn't have been any better if I'd taken another vehicle. There was also an incident that wasn't without its curious aspects. In the early morning hours, the driver of my Volkswagen came running up to me, out of breath. He excitedly reported that he had been hit by a Russian anti-tank gun. The engine had broken down, and he had left the car on the highway. I drove back 2 kilometers on high alert, constantly expecting the anti-tank gun to fire its first shot. However, everything was quiet, and I finally found myself in front of our Volkswagen. I carefully got out to inspect the side that had taken the hit, but I couldn't find any holes. An oil slick on the ground helped us solve the mystery. The piston had punctured the oil pan. The powerful blow, which echoed like thunder in the silence of the night, startled the poor guy, and he, thinking he'd been shot, bolted like lightning. This could have happened to even a seasoned fighter. No one should be confused if something like this happens to them sometimes. The worst part of the whole affair was that my last car had broken down. I rode my motorcycle through Dunaburg, then turned northwest onto the highway leading to Riga. After riding about 8 kilometers, we turned off the road to the northeast and passed several small villages. We crossed the railroad tracks, after which a wooded area spread out before us. It stretched north of Dunaburg from west to east, along the entire length of the Dunaburg to Rositten highway. There was no sign of Russians anywhere. On the road, I met Oberleutnant Wolf, who commanded a reconnaissance platoon. He had just returned from the forest and had already traveled the route we intended to take, but in the opposite direction. I asked him to wait for my tanks, which had likely already reached the outskirts of Dunaburg, and invited him to dinner, featuring his favorite sauerkraut and dumplings, which my cook had promised. This invitation likely saved my life, as I later learned. If his car hadn't been available, I wouldn't have made it to the hospital in time. We then rode east on the motorcycle into the forest within the city limits of Dunaburg. We turned south and pulled up alongside an anti-tank gun positioned on our border at the far left end of the front line, but whose crew had no communication with their neighbor on the right. At first, however, the soldiers covering the front from the north mistook us for Russians. Thank God they recognized us in time. I briefly explained to the gun crew commander what we needed and that we would soon take up a position to his left. If we needed to fall back toward Dunaburg, I would let him know. Meanwhile, evening had fallen, and I returned to my tanks on the highway. I took both Tigers with me, which had been left about 2 kilometers north of the road for safety. Eichhorn and Göring commanded the tanks. 2 other tanks followed them, and then we drove along the same route I had previously scouted on a motorcycle. We had to cross several small bridges after we turned off the highway to the northeast. These plank bridges were so short that even our tanks could cross them. Only one of them was a bit too long. But fortunately, we found a ford and finally reached the railroad without incident. Trains had gathered there, some carrying the wounded, all heading for Riga. However, the road was completely gridlocked. The railroad workers were already preparing to abandon the trains, convinced that the Russians were approaching. They thought they had already heard several gunshots. At the sight of our tigers, they calmed down somewhat, especially after I assured them that they could safely remain where they were, at least until evening, waiting for our return. At every bridge we crossed, I left a soldier from the reconnaissance platoon behind, because all the bridges had already been prepared for destruction. Incidentally, there were no sappers there anymore, but anyone could easily light the fuse before we returned. I wanted to avoid that at all costs. Sappers were hard at work everywhere. They even turned the warning signs the opposite way, hoping the Russians would head in the wrong direction. This trick sometimes worked later on the Western Front against the Americans, but it didn't work at all with the Russians. We crossed the railroad tracks and approached the village where I intended to position my tanks. From the northern end of the village, a forest stretched out before us for about a kilometer. Before nightfall, we managed to set up an excellent defensive position, taking up a circular defense. I planned to march back to the highway at night after a few volleys from our guns. This was supposed to make the Russians think we were still here. As I approached the entrance to the village, I stopped. It was a small village, whose main street turned at a right angle to the northwest and gave way to a dirt path. People sometimes develop a sort of sixth sense in the extreme situations of their lives. I looked through my binoculars over the rooftops and found it strange that there wasn't a soul on the street, though women could be seen pressed against the windows. A boy was running toward me from the village, and I stopped him. I asked the boy in my amazing Russian, "Are there Russian soldiers here?" Surprisingly, he answered immediately, 3 kilometers away." How did he know that so well? After all, I had driven through there just a few hours ago and hadn't noticed a single Russian soldier. Lieutenant Eichhorn urged me to ride behind both tanks on my motorcycle, because everything seemed very strange to him as well. Despite this, I drove into the village ahead of both tanks and directed them to take up a position on the northern edge. Earlier, I had left Sergeant Kirscher and Corporal Kramer, the latter in my Tiger tank, to guard the turnoff to Riga. They were to wait there until we returned after dark. It was quiet everywhere. I drove along a path through the field to the northwest. I wanted to get a better view of the area from a small hill and survey the forest more thoroughly. I saw the roof of a farmhouse peeking out from behind the hill. It was to the left of the road. We had passed that spot a few hours earlier during a reconnaissance raid. We climbed the hill, where I ordered a stop. Then I pored over my map to get my bearings. Suddenly, my driver shouted, "Russians in the farmhouse!" They had already opened fire. I glanced to the left and shouted, "Turn back!" Everything else happened in a flash. We jumped off the motorcycle. The medic jumped into a ditch unharmed, but I was wounded in the left thigh. We tried to crawl back to the village, but my strength soon failed me. I ordered the medic to leave and warn Lieutenant Eichhorn of the danger, but my loyal driver refused to abandon me in my hour of need. He dragged me along with even greater determination, repeating that the Russians were getting closer and closer. Every time we raised our heads above the roadside, the Russians fired like madmen. I kept calling out to Eichhorn, as if he could hear me. People do a lot of senseless things in moments like that. Despite my wound, I crawled slowly, trying with all my might. However, the Russians were getting closer and closer. They certainly hadn't noticed our tanks. They were hidden by the high ground. Meanwhile, I'd lost my notebook. My ever-present cap had flown off my head earlier when I jumped into the ditch. That was a bad sign. Marvitz, who later found the cap, kept it as a talisman during his long stay in Russian captivity. Meanwhile, the Russians crossed the road and jumped into our ditch. Every time we moved, they opened fire. The bullets whizzing past me didn't hit Loki either because I was shielding him with my body. He sustained a laceration. The other bullets hit me. A bullet pierced the upper part of my right arm, and 4 more hit my back. Because the numerous wounds, especially in my back, were bleeding heavily, I soon became completely exhausted and could not move. When we stopped, the shooting ceased. Suddenly, my rapidly fading will to live was revived. I could clearly hear the roar of my tank's engines, a sound in which I heard my salvation. Eichhorn and Göring heard the gunfire and drove over to see what was happening. Adding to my joy, I began to hope I might get out of this mess alive. But suddenly, death stood before me in all its glory. 3 Russians approached from behind and suddenly found themselves 3 meters behind me. I will never forget that sight in my life. I was covered in blood from numerous wounds. I had no strength left, and I could hear the roar of my Tiger's engines, which were probably already too late. Like a wounded beast that sees hunters approaching and can no longer flee, I looked around. A Russian officer stood in the middle. He shouted, "Hands up!" The soldiers to his left and right aimed their submachine guns at us. Fortunately, the Russians were still afraid that I might get the idea to shoot. I probably would have thought the same thing if I were in their place. But at that moment, I couldn't think at all. I simply couldn't physically reach my weapon since I was lying on my uninjured right arm. And then, my tanks burst out. Firing their machine guns wildly, they didn't hit anyone, but the unexpected appearance of the Tigers naturally stunned the Russians. Both soldiers immediately ran away, but the officer raised his pistol to finish me off. In the state I was in, I had no desire to face death. I turned toward my approaching tanks. It was a stroke of luck and my salvation. The Russian pulled the trigger 3 times, but he was so agitated that 2 shots missed and only 1 hit its mark. The bullet passed very close to my spinal cord in the neck area, but miraculously, not a single tendon or artery was touched. I was amazed that I was still alive. In any case, if I hadn't turned toward my Tigers, the bullet would have pierced my larynx, and these lines would never have been written. In the literal sense of the word, my comrades arrived at the very last second. Lieutenant Eichhorn drove past me, while Sergeant Major Göring immediately stood beside me. I cannot convey the wonderful feeling of security that came over me then. It didn't even occur to me that anything might happen to me as a result of the subsequent shots. Staff Corporal Marvitz, Göring's gunner, leaped out of the open turret hatch and jumped into the trench next to me. He didn't know whether to bandage me or apply tourniquets, since blood was gushing from everywhere. The coveralls I was wearing had turned into rags. Marvitz tore off his own straps and tightly bound my thigh above the wound. Fortunately for me, these straps were high quality and elastic. Otherwise, I would have lost my leg because of the tourniquet. Later, I was often asked if it hurt. No one could have imagined that I actually felt nothing due to the excitement and exhaustion from the massive blood loss. I was in a state of pleasant fatigue, but I was afraid I would lose consciousness. I perceived the bullets hitting me simply as blows, not as pain. Once my leg was bandaged, Marvits, supporting me from behind, hoisted me onto the rear of the tank. Even today, it remains a mystery to me how I managed to get there at all. Then I was, in fact, standing behind the turret with one leg dangling in the air. I clung tightly to the edge of the turret, and suddenly, to top it all off, more shots rang out from behind. Then it became clear to me why not a single Russian had been visible in the village before. Several of their soldiers had already risked entering the houses and had been caught off guard by us. Seeing the tanks in front of them, they chose to remain under cover, but then began to show signs of life. I ordered Goring to turn the turret back. He reacted so quickly that he pinned my uninjured leg between the turret and the hull. Because of this, my good leg was nearly crippled for life. Even today, I cannot understand why not a single shot hit me when I was standing out in the open at the rear of the tank. We fought our way back through the village and met Oberleutnant Wolf on the outskirts. As if foreseeing events, he was waiting for us with his car behind the village. Yet nothing had happened to him. I was settled more comfortably in the back seat of the car. I ordered Lieutenant Ihorn to drive back to the road immediately and blow up the bridges. Unfortunately, Ihorn did not follow my order. The car finally started moving, and realizing I was saved, I completely weakened. I had lost a great deal of blood and could barely speak. Wolf was from Pirmasens, located just 24 kilometers from my hometown. He held my head in his lap and encouraged me. I could only whisper, "Tell my parents how it all happened, and that there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I feel as if it's all over for me." Wolf didn't believe I'd make it through the journey either, as he later admitted to me in a letter. Nevertheless, I arrived home safe and sound, while my comrade died in East Prussia shortly before the end of the war. I didn't regain consciousness until they were about to transfer me to an ambulance. By that time, we had long since crossed the dune. I deeply regretted not having had time to say goodbye to Kircher and Kramer. The people who were treating me also did not deem it necessary to send me off with the battalion, as I had wished before my evacuation. Of course, I had no idea why they were in such a hurry to send me off. Adding to my suffering was the fact that I was not allowed to drink at all, even though I was terribly thirsty after losing so much blood. However, the conscientious medics feared I might have a wound in my abdomen. Today, I have to agree with them, but back then, I cursed like there was no tomorrow. I was wounded around 8 in the evening and regained consciousness at the field hospital around 1 in the morning. Even today, I can still see Hermann Wolf before my eyes, running around like a madman in search of a doctor. When Wolf finally found him, the doctor said that my leg was unlikely to be saved because it had been constricted for too long. But fortunately, after half an hour, the blood began to circulate again, and none of the arteries had been damaged. The doctor gave me a dose of morphine. When I woke up again, I was a prisoner of the bandages, wrapped from head to toe like in a cocoon. Only my right hand, left leg, and head were visible. I felt more than uncomfortable. Then I received another blood transfusion, after which I perked up noticeably. They carried me into the ward like a sack. All the beds around me were occupied by the seriously wounded. When I saw my comrades suffering, I felt a deep sense of gratitude to fate that I had gotten off relatively lightly. I felt no pain at all. I was incredibly lucky that the many bullets that had struck me had not damaged my nerve endings. I was able to converse quite coherently with the doctor who made the morning rounds. The first person to visit me the next day was my commander, Major Schwanner. Tears welled up in our eyes when we saw each other again. Then I reported, "We engaged the enemy." When he saw me, he even forgot to scold me about the motorcycle, which was now a pile of scrap metal. He was the last one in the company. After Major Schwanner, Oberfeldwebel Delzit appeared. I could sense how hard it was for him to hide the truth from me. By then, I knew for certain that I would have to say goodbye, the hardest goodbye of my entire life. Of course, I was spouting nonsense about returning to the company soon. Delzit believed even less than I did that I would be able to keep my promise. As a consolation, the battalion adjutant shared some news with me. Following our major success, Corps headquarters had included my name among those awarded the oak leaves. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized this was more than just a consolation. My condition improved noticeably over the course of the day. I noticed this because I felt like smoking. The doctor forbade me from smoking, noting that my lungs had been shot through, which categorically ruled out smoking. However, I kept begging him. It was precisely through smoking that I could prove my lungs were fine. If my lungs had been punctured, the smoke would have escaped through the wounds in my back. The medic couldn't argue with my logic. My persistent pleas probably convinced him. However, I continued to lament my fate. I couldn't understand why I had to be shot at the very moment when my comrades in arms needed me most. On the very day I was wounded, I was officially appointed company commander. Unfortunately, the joy of receiving this post was short-lived. At first, it was supposed that I would fly back to Germany by plane, but many soldiers needed urgent air transport more than I did, so I stayed at the medical battalion for 2 more days. During their daily visits, my comrades kept me informed of all the news from our unit. They told me that Lieutenant Eichhorn had not returned that night, but the next day had allowed himself to be misled and had attacked the village from the front, where large Russian tank forces had already concentrated. Of course, his attack was repelled. Eichhorn was an excellent officer, but he still lacked experience. He had only recently joined the company after graduating from Armored Forces School. His comrades also recounted how he managed, with great difficulty, to reach the highway to Riga, which was already under Russian control. The unit broke through between Joseph Stalin and T-34-85 tanks. Only one Tiger managed to reach the bridge across the Dvina, which was already under enemy fire. Our company suffered more casualties, killed and wounded, on that fateful day than in all previous operations combined. Those who managed to escape their burning tanks had to swim across the Dvina to save themselves. Our company never fully recovered from that heavy bloodletting. Soon, Ninstedt and Eichhorn were wounded, and new officers arrived who were not as familiar with the troops. Major Schwanner was later replaced by a commander who turned out to be a complete failure. Our remaining tanks were transferred to separate units, and they were lost, one after another. With a heavy heart, I returned home, sailing from Reval. The Russians had already cut off the railway lines. 14 days later, I arrived in Germany. In Schwinemünde, we were loaded into surprisingly clean cars of a medical train. For the first time in a long while, I lay on clean white sheets. One might say too luxurious for an ordinary soldier like me. When I arrived in Lingen on the Inns River, I weighed 39.5 kilograms. At the time, I didn't believe I would attempt to walk for the first time by the end of September. It was in the hospital that I first read in an old newspaper, which a fellow soldier had brought along, that on July 27, 1944, I had been awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. I was the 535th Wehrmacht soldier to receive this award. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. Bye for now, everyone. See you next time.